I'm gonna start speaking as we start making our way to our seats. So good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. And welcome to tonight's discussion on colonial traces, time, space, place, and the university, where we will be posing the question: 100 years of the Colonial University in Africa. And welcome also to the Wits Origin Center, which is a museum dedicated to the history of humanity and the African roots of the evolution of humankind. And we're sitting in this room surrounded by these beautiful hand-embroidered tapestries that depict the history of the sand in southern Africa. So if anyone has an opportunity to visit the museum, I highly recommend it. So tonight's discussion is the second event in SWOP's 100 Years of the Colonial University in Africa program. And I'm going to read a short excerpt here to tell you a little bit more about that program. So it says, as we celebrate Wits in its centenary year, it's also important that we reflect on the moments of challenge, contestation, and contradiction that have shaped it over time. This allows us to reflect on the different ways in which the university has functioned, been experienced, and been responded to in a changing society, from colonialism to segregation to apartheid to the present. More importantly, it allows us to continue to imagine and relate to the university as a place of critique, dissent, and struggle. Over its long history, Wits has been a place from which challenges of and to different aspects of the society have emerged. But there have also been times when the university itself has experienced differences and contestations within, forcing it to reimagine itself. These have emerged mainly from experiences of exclusion, violence, and dislocation, determined by differences of class, race, gender, sex, and sexuality. There are then many histories of Wits. These can be told in many ways and from many perspectives. In reflecting on its 100 years of existence, we have shaped the following program with the aim of revealing and recording some of these hidden histories and untold stories, and to facilitate critical forms of analysis and engagement of and with its past, and of this past in its present. Alongside written and spoken forms of interaction, music, poetry, photography, and other artistic practices will provide moments and spaces for relating to and remembering the university in, from, and with difference. So the first event was a reflection on the October 6th movement, which emerged in 2015 and was dedicated to remembering the coming together of students and workers under that hashtag in 2015, in the moments that led up to FISMA's fall. Tonight's discussion will be focused on the concepts of coloniality and the idea of decolonisation as they apply to the university today. These two concepts were central to the FISMA's fall and outsourcing school protests that rocked the university system in 2015 and 2016. Today, as the dust settles on yet another cycle of student protests, by financial exclusion and accommodation issues, and in the ongoing context of strikes by university workers, we thought it was a timely moment to return to these questions and to think together about the nature of the university and the root causes of its persistent exclusions and oppressions, and of course the possibilities and limitations for decolonisation. So here to lead us in this discussion, and I hope that it will be a discussion, and I invite you all to participate, please, are Motimele, who's over here, and Maluleka, and Prishani Naidoo, who is joining us from Santiago, Chile, and who has recorded a presentation. So I will tell you a bit more of the speakers as the presentations come up, but for now, let's just say that Paul is Dr. Paul Maluleka, not quite yet. Is based in the School of Education at Wits, and Moshibudi Motimele is based at the University of the Free State and is also registered for a PhD at Wits. So before we jump into it, let me just say a couple of what we call housekeeping things. If you want to connect to the Wi-Fi, you can connect to the Wits guest network. The details are over there. The toilets are just outside here. And that's about it. There's a register over here. Please do add your name if you would like to be added to the mailing list. And we'd appreciate it if you would sign in anyway, because it's just nice for us to have a record of who's been at these events. There's also on the table some stickers that we've made that say decolonize and Colonial University, question mark. So of course we would never encourage you to do vandalism, but just do help yourself to those stickers. Okay, so if there's no questions at this stage, yes, go ahead.
Who's speaking to us?
Oh yes, my name is Maluleka. I am the program coordinator at SWOP. I'm also registered for a PhD at Wits. And yes, and it's very good to be here, and thank you all for being here. And let's have a round of applause. Okay, wonderful. Are we ready to roll with Prishani? So let me just say a few words about Prishani, and then we'll start. So Prishani is the director of SWOP, a position she's held since 2019. She came to Joburg and Wits in 1992, first to study medicine, but her interest shifted to the humanities. She has a PhD in development studies and is also a member of the sociology department at Wits, where she's taught since 2008. Prishani also has a long history of activism in the student movement in South Africa in the 1990s and the new social movements that emerged in the 2000s. Becoming a part of the Alter Globalized.
We can still hear you.
If I speak like this, okay.
YouTube.
But sorry, Brian, there's a red light here. Okay, it's running green now. So I'm going to try again.
All right.
Ready, go.
Okay. Okay. No. Yes? No. Okay, I'm going to use my sharp steward's voice. So, let me start that sentence again. Prishani has a long history of activism in the student movement in South Africa in the 1990s and the new social movements that emerged in the 2000s, becoming a part of the ultra-globalization movement. Her intellectual interests center on questions of political subjectivity, resistance, and possibilities for alternatives to the organization of society that lie outside the frames of wage work, the political party, and the nation state. So, with that said, let's hear from Prishani. She comes to us from Santiago, Chile.
As I speak. This is just quite an alienating experience, not having anyone to speak to. And I'm sorry that I'm not able to be physically present with you for this conversation. But at the same time, I think the concept of coloniality, the call to decolonize, put at the very center questions of displacement, being out of time, occupying space differently. And I've been forced over the last while to reflect very differently on the question set of the conversation. So I don't have a lot of time, 10 minutes, but what I'm going to do is share with you a few photographs from my last just over 2 weeks in Chile, where I have been able to come as a result of where I sit in the university today. And I think if I'd been in South Africa, I would be speaking very differently about the relationship between transformation and decolonization, the call to decolonize being particular moment in South Africa's history, and my own experience of being other in the university in South Africa. But I think that the call to decolonize and coloniality have also been important in making the argument that the colonial experience, the matrix of power that colonialism imposed, enforced, and entrenched, continues beyond the period that we've been taught as the decolonizing. And I think being in a different place also forces one to think about other others and coming together with other others and coming together from places that share experiences of colonialism, but in very different ways, and sit with common problems that emerge from those experiences that could shape and should shape relationships and constitutions of being other differently today. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I'd hoped that I'd be able to share my beautiful day view with you, but I've been fighting sound and light issues all day, so this is the best time to record. But this is my day, just to give you a sense of where I am at the moment. But over the last just over 2 weeks, I've been south of Santiago in a place called Valdivia. And if you look at a map, you might think that this south that lies just west of us is a close place to reach. You could just hop over to the other side. But it took me over 40 hours to get there, traveling through Paris, Sao Paulo, and Santiago to get to a place that felt like the world had shrunk. And I realized just why Dustin, colleague, compañero, and research associate at SWOP, wanted me to come physically to visit the place. This is Dustin Julian Beja, who is based at the Universidad Austral in Valdivia. And it's not just a sense of a different place, space, and time, but also the ways in which we become accustomed to relate to others from other souths in ways that are inflected through the north, or that are shaped and mediated by and through the north. Here you see Dustin in his study. He came to know about SWOP because he himself studied in Germany, forced to study in Germany when his supervisor was exiled due to the dictatorship in Chile. And he came to know of Eddie Webster's work, met Eddie, and came to know about SWOP through Eddie's relationship to Kassel University. I met Dustin first in 2019 when I started at SWOP, and we began our conversations about possibilities for collaborating across countries and universities, in particular through a common interest in precarious society, which Carl Holt began to expand SWOP's work through when he became director after Eddie Webster, and a concept that we have been using at SWOP, and that Dustin and colleagues in Chile have been expanding through their own relationship that has put at the center of their understanding of precarious society the experience of colonialism and the continued experience of colonialism in the form of coloniality. And so my time in Valdivia has really been one of sensing the differences across our countries in terms of experience of colonialism and what that means in our present. Here you see very similar pictures to what we have in South Africa, but you also sense in very real terms the presence of a colonial past. These are pictures from an existing celebration of that past of a castle or fort that was built by the Spanish to ward off the Dutch. So Valdivia is a small city to the south of Santiago with a population of no more than 200,000. These are also pictures from the fort. And in addition to being colonized by the Spanish and Valdivia itself getting its name from its so-called founder, Pedro Valdivia, in spite of the land being occupied prior to that invasion by the indigenous people, the Mapuche and Mapungu. And you also get the sense of that history, in very everyday terms. This is, a German thank you for visiting a local supermarket. But I think, in addition to or in spite of the differences, there are also certain common features of that colonial history in our presence. And I think in South Africa, across Africa, in many different countries having experienced colonization, you still find a church and a clock. And I think that gives us a sense of a very real structuring of time that we live with in the present that comes from the 2 weeks as I moved from South Africa to Valdivia, also considering loved ones in different places. London's there because my little sister is in London. But I think, at the same time as we feel and sense and experience that past and the present, there are other common elements to, or there have been parts of my experience here that resonate differently, particularly in terms of resistance. And resistance in different ways. So here, or in Valdivia, marijuana is illegal in terms of its sale, but it can be produced for individual use, so you see grow shops everywhere, and Ahmed has said to me that there's a Wali coffee in Cape Town. So, very few McDonald's in Valdivia, there's just one McDonald's, but other forms of everyday life that resonate with us in South Africa. From the streets to toilet doors, to the university. And I related to, or my presence in Valdivia, I made sense of from 2015 at Wits University. And I've shared this picture in particular because I think at the same time there's a common experience across our countries, across our universities, of the erasure of struggle. And here the trace after the attempt to erase the graffiti of Solomon Mahlangu in 2015. A different way of remembering 2015 and Solomon Mahlangu in that moment, this during COVID. And it was just a few weeks ago. But I think so being here, putting my feet in the Pacific Ocean, seeing the world from a different perspective has been important not just in a geographical sense, but also for connecting with others in different ways. So I ended up giving one presentation. I was supposed to give 4 public presentations. I ended up giving one public presentation. It was really difficult for all of us because issues of translation, also just a sense of history of South Africa that is lacking here, and a history of Chile that we share in South Africa. But far more meaningful encounters with colleagues in more informal settings. So many meetings with colleagues in the university, but here I'm sharing 2 pictures. On the left, Dustin with Rodriguez, a teacher at both the universities, or 2 of the universities in Valdivia, while he's walking from one lecture at one university to give a lecture at another university, and making time to speak to me with Dustin doing the translation informally. The public presentation, I should also say, the formal translator wasn't available, and it ended up being a Brazilian who has come to settle in Valdivia because of a job and because of love, but mainly because of a job. And in the picture on the right, you see 2 Mapuche has a geography. This is a full-time job in a university, and that relates also to the ways in which Mapuche representation in the university system has been approached in terms of policy. But also to say, I has to speak because she's half Mapuche and half Italian, and has moved back to Chile because of a loss of a job in Italy. And then Italia next to her is from Colombia, also here because of studying and because of love, and then Dustin. And I'm sharing these because I think, the question of colonial traces is multi-layered. And I think precarious society, if we're going to reflect on through the lens of coloniality and the experience of the continued structure or structures of power that it produced in the present, we also need to consider the shared experiences within the University of Precarity. Dustin himself moved to Valdivia during COVID because he lost a job in one of the major universities in Santiago. And most of the colleagues I met are in precarious positions within the university or the university themselves. But I think at the same time, a shared sensibility amongst colleagues that there are possibilities for not just destroying in terms of that colonial matrix of power, but also for constituting new relations, and new relations that are imagined outside of how time, place, and space are configured within that matrix. And here, these pictures, I think, for me, showing the necessity and the possibility to imagine without horizons, beyond horizons. And that's a lot of the work we've already been doing with colleagues in Mexico, through the lens of uncertainty and the yet to come. And also sharing experiences with activists from Rojava who visited us in South Africa, not just once, but over a few years now. But I think, as I'm saying, there's a necessity for us to think how to decolonize in terms of the kinds of relations we constitute. This is not an easy task. I'm coming back with lots of books, presents, but also books I've bought, hoping that I will learn Spanish. But I think questions of translation sit also at the very center of our responsibility to decolonize. And translation, not just in terms of words, but also taking seriously questions of time, place, space, and our relationship to the present or our presence from multiple pasts, and pasts that are able to be reconfigured through our retracings together of the colonial traces we feel and continue to feel today. So I'm going to end with this beautiful painting on a bus stop. Central to the responsibility to decolonize is also to consider how our sense of self, of place, of time, of space has also been structured by a particular way of thinking the human in relation to the non-human. And I'm going to leave it here, hoping that this is enough of a contribution that will allow for the conversation tonight to be fruitful and for our conversations to come to take us elsewhere. Thank you.
Prishani is with us on the live stream on YouTube. She's not zooming in, but she is here in a way, and I wanted to say thank you very much to her for this contribution, because in the conversations that led to the shaping of this program, this 100 Years of the Colonial University in Africa program, one of those discussions was about the kind of insular nature of the celebrations that were happening around the Wits centenary. And even though Wits in many ways has a proud history in terms of its engagement with its society, that's not the conversations that were happening. So thank you for allowing this conversation today to also be inflected with a recognition that coloniality is not something that we're dealing with only here, and questions of decolonization, these are conversations that are happening all over the world and that need to be in conversation with each other through various kinds of modes of translation in order for them to be powerful. So thank you to Prishani, who's also asked me to just make a couple of clarifications regarding this. So just in case it wasn't clear when there was that sign that said bienvenidos and then welcome and then in German, it's because Valdivia was colonized by the Spanish, but then also was subject to a German invasion as well. So you see these multiple languages in a place like the airport that reflect that colonial history. The other thing that she wanted to clarify was she mentioned Eddie Webster's relationship to Daston, and I think she said that it was through Colonial University, but actually it was through Jen University. So those are Prishani's corrections, and thanks again, Prishani. And the next person who will speak will be Paul Maluleka, but before we get to him, not to open up a full discussion now, but if anyone would like to make a brief comment at this stage, you're welcome. Okay, quick one, thank you.
Hi, this is going to sound controversial.
Bring it.
I don't think decolonization of education or any other thing is possible or is going to happen anytime soon. And maybe it's about time we change the conversations from decolonizing into maybe something like transforming, integrating, what do you call this, like indigenous Please, everyone here, yes. Write history. Yes, I do know that there are. Maybe there is lots of information, but is it accessible to people? Because I haven't had a lot of information, to be quite honest, or access to that kind of information. And then besides that, it's just something that I think about, let's say like conversations that I have with my dad. And before my grand passed away last year, most times when I went home, I'd make sure that I asked her something about the past, like how it was for her to work in the farms where she was earning 2 rand, get beaten for nothing, the kind of stuff. Just get that kind of knowledge. With my dad, he used to help out with my grand, who used to be a traditional healer. He knew hands and all the kind of stuff. So my dad still has that bit of knowledge. So I try to ask him, okay, I have tonsils and blah, 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 blah. But those are things that I ask from my parents. Is there anywhere where, like a platform, you're saying that there is, like a platform where we can actually read about such things? I mean, a lot of the medications that we use now are stolen concepts from indigenous people somewhere in the world. But that information is lost. So personally, I don't think decolonisation is possible. Sorry for talking for so long.
No, thank you. That was a very helpful, I think, convocation. And we have, okay. And I see that the conversation is already simmering under the surface, which is what we love to see. So, Paul, if you will come and join us, and Shibu as well, same time. And let me just tell you a little bit about Paul before he jumps into his presentation. So Paul Maluleka holds a Master of Education with distinction in History of Education and lectures History of Education and Social Sciences at the Wits School of Education. His research and teaching interests focus on education decolonisation, decoloniality, and Africanization in the South African academe and basic education. Maluleka is a co-editor of the book entitled Decolonizing Knowledge and Knowers, Struggles for University Transformation in South Africa, which was published in 2022 by Routledge. He's also a doctoral fellow at the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences and is a Killie Campbell Scholar. So thank you very much for being here, Paul, and let me hand over to you.
Evening, everyone. Okay, so I actually wrote down my presentation, so I'm going to read out what I actually wrote. So I start this presentation by pointing out some of the questions posed to us that I intend on responding to. And these are 3 questions, right? The first one, can we speak of Wits as a colonial university today? Should we speak of Wits as a colonial university today? What are the kinds of changes needed to erase traces of colonial in the university today? And fourthly, what are the possibilities and limits for these kinds of change today? So to start off my presentation, I first actually framed my presentation around the 2015-2016 Fees Must Fall or the Must Fall protests, which I was actually privileged to be part of. I was actually enrolled for my honors degree at the time. So I see this protest as what they have done. They have actually reignited calls for the decolonization, Africanization, and transformation of education in post-colonial South Africa generally, and the university specifically. protest, as we all might know now, is that they were born out of the frustration that we experience as Black African students in institutions of higher learning, such as Wits. And these frustrations were as a result of the funding crisis, which is actually ongoing even today. Recently, the students were protesting around fees and all of that. And we know that so-called historically Black universities have been protesting around fees and all of that. But also, the frustration was around the marginalized experiences of Black African female and the LGBTQIA academic staff and students, the plight of workers and outsourcing, the often forgotten experiences of disabled students and staff, the role of language as a symbolic representation of the hegemonic cultures, epistemic racism and cultural alienation, the deeply contested notions of higher education curriculum as an institution that embodies Eurocentric and alienating values and beliefs, and many other issues that students actually raised in 2015 and 2016. So all of this were because of a pervasive coloniality and its power matrix, right? So decolonial scholars such as Maldonado Torres speak of coloniality as a phenomenon that survives colonialism. It is maintained alive in books, in their criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. So, what does coloniality do? So it continues to construct the colonized, who are Black African, as non-beings or non-humans. What Ngasana called natives of nowhere, who are primitive, inferior, irrational, and Black. So based on this understanding, I am of the view that we can and we should certainly speak of Wits as a colonial university, because nothing has changed, right? So what kinds of changes needed to erase traces of colonial in the university today? So there's no doubt in my mind that colonization needs to happen for us to arrive at the promised land. This is because coloniality emphasizes the knowledge and know us as inseparable. So it speaks about I am, therefore I know, therefore I am. However, I think it would be unwise and certainly unproductive for us to even think we can erase traces of colonial in the university, be it today or be it tomorrow. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that in as much as we want to rethink, reimagine the university, we can't do away with the colonial experience. So we have to find ways of actually engaging that colonial experience. So what does this mean for the decolonial project, you may ask? In my view, there are currently two dominant decolonization discourses in South Africa. Right? So the first is what I call a nativist delinking approach that recenters decolonial and African-centeredness discourses, ontologies, building, because that's where my research is actually focused on. The editors of the book that we published, an ecology of knowledges of the book that we published, an ecology of knowledges approach, which demands co-presence, incompleteness, intersubjective dialogue, thinking beyond the canonical line, and the incorporation of the repressed and those knowledges that have been discursively marginalized. So in other words, what we propose to register in that book is that we have to have a decolonial project which is inclusive. So in a curriculum knowledge building exercise, it will say, let's rather frame the colonial, what we consider as colonial as well as what we consider as indigenous as equals. Right? And we build a curriculum from that, as opposed to saying whatever we consider as the colonial, we discard of it, we can't engage it because it's colonial and all that. That for us, I think, was not productive at all. So with this, a new question actually arises. How then do we achieve this in ways that are cumulative and productive? And again, I'm posing this question around curriculum knowledge building, right? Because I'm coming from an education background. So for us, when we speak of curriculum knowledge building, it goes beyond this idea of saying, let's replace this text with this one, right? So we look at the intrinsic nature of curriculum knowledge building. There are a lot of players who actually are involved in curriculum building and all of that. So who is legitimated, who is delegitimated, who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice, and those who don't have voices, how then do we actually bring them into the conversation? So I think this question speaks directly to the limits of the decolonial scholarship generally. So I say this because if you read the decolonial scholarship, most of the time they tell us about the history of the decolonial movement and why there's a need to actually decolonize and all of that. But its limits is on the how. How then do we do it in ways which are cumulative and productive? So there's a need, I think, to research and theorize about how to overcome the limitations of decolonial scholarship. And I certainly hope that part of the discussions here and beyond will be focused on thinking deeply about this. And thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Paul, who I think also began to speak back to the provocation that was made earlier, because Paul also suggested that it was unwise and unproductive to imagine that we can erase the traces of the colonial in the university, and that we rather need to think about how we engage with this colonial experience that is inescapable, that is an inescapable part of our history. And then pose the question that I hope we can think a bit more deeply about is how do we do that? You know, beyond a kind of willfulness. What might that look like? So the last, and actually maybe what I'll do once again before we move on to Shibu is to allow for one or two short comments, if there are any that have come up yet. Okay, we've got one there and one there.
My name is Kenny Mobasa. I'm not an academic. I just want to share a joke. It may not be funny, but it's a joke anyway. Why do we want to decolonize? Hence, one of our own, Elon Musk, is advocating for multi-planetary species. We're going to colonize Mars. You know, don't you think we should be really honing our skills in terms of colonization instead of decolonization? I don't know if it's funny, but I thought it's funny.
Well, at least it was framed as a joke. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ahmed from my sons. So, I mean, I can't help myself. This room is a little bit weird, right? And the space generally is a kind of project that is maybe what someone might even call an inclusive decolonization project, right? It's the origin center and we're surrounded by these kind of representations of indigeneity that have a particular kind of zhuzhiness about it. And so I want to kind of bring this into the conversation as well. You know, the ways in which we occupy these kinds of spaces that are like Wits, Wits, you ask any kind of manager at Wits and they're committed to a project of decolonization. And they'll point to projects like the Origin Center and so on, in showing how they actually have contributed to it. And so I do think, what's nice about what's happening here in this weird space is the terms of a debate. I hope, and I like the way that you've actually framed it between this kind of open, inclusive project of decolonization, and let's, just bracket off whether, I would characterize it like that, but nonetheless, and something else, what you consider a kind of an activist idea of decolonization. I do want to say, as a phenomenon, the idea that indigeneity and what is indigenous, is somehow connected to a past that's forgotten. We want to move away from it. You know what I mean? Our all-stars and kids are also a kind of expression of a form of indigeneity with a particular swear. And so, what I'd like to us to return to is an identity of that other project of decolonization. And like some of the people that I've seen here, I last met, or not last met, but that's been an exaggeration. But I met on the streets, and I'm interested in the agency of their project precisely insofar as I think this other project of decolonization often works as a rebound from the energy that's created on the streets. To the extent that kind of professors at Stellenbosch are writing papers about why we need an inclusive project of decolonization, is because people went out on the street and demanded something. And so, yeah, I'd like us to also keep that as we occupy this space.
Shop, thank you very much, Ahmed. And we carry that with us for the rest of the evening. And I don't doubt that Shibu will speak in some way to some of these questions. So just before we hear what she has to say, let me introduce Moshibudi Motimele as a lecturer in the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of the Free State. She's also a doctoral candidate in the Department of Politics at the University of the Witwatersrand. Shibu is a recipient of 2 fellowships, one by the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and the second a Transforming the Humanities Through Interdisciplinary Knowledge Fellowship. So, Shibu, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thanks, Lindy. So, yeah, thanks for that introduction, and thanks to SWOP for the invitation. When I saw that the theme was around coloniality, I was both excited and depressed by the opportunity to speak around this for a number of reasons. I think thinking about my trajectory alongside, around, outside of, and within this concept as both a student, activist, teacher, it's been really interesting to see how over the last 5 to 8 years this idea of coloniality itself has come to colonize the space and forms of activism, but at the same time it's been also co-opted as a form of sort of like progressiveness within the university specifically. So I had a conversation with Paul about what we'd shared today, and the first provocation that Lindy shared with us was to say what we understand by coloniality. And so I said, Paul, please do that like Torres conceptual stuff, because like I'm really disillusioned and despondent around it, but also my experience has made me want to start from a different perspective. So I'm going to start with a message from my current departmental WhatsApp group that we have. And this was sent by our most senior professor in our department, who has taught at both the UP and UFS for about the last 25 to 30 years. and he sends us an article that another member of our department wrote, basically about how shit everything is, the country, governance, the ANC people. And this is what he says. I won't say his name because there's already 99.9 reasons why they'd fire me, and I won't want to give them the 0.1. But he says this. This is so true around how everyone and everything is shit. I am marking the third year scripts now and thus assessing their analytical and writing skills. From what I can experience, I can only say this. More potholes, more poor health services, more safety and security issues, etc. More state degeneration in general will be our destiny if the majority of the students in my class enter the public service. The bottom line is this. Most of the students in my class should not be doing university studies, but rather be trained for something else. And as like a 60-year-old African, I can imagine what those something else's are. The second form of experience I want to start with is that I had the opportunity to be invited a few weeks ago to participate in the Wits postgraduate orientation. And the person who invited me was really excited because this is the first time postgrads would get an orientation as well, not just undergrads. And part of what they built into that orientation was a discussion with current postgraduate students who could gesture towards not only some of the challenges but opportunities of being a Wits postgraduate student. And as you can imagine, we had people from the Dean of Students and the DVCs, whatever, speaking about how postgrads are the future and your research must be relevant and you're going to transform the world. And you know, the university is committed to not only decolonial scholarship but socially relevant scholarship, etc., etc. And so you had all these formal positions of power in the university narrating all these like really great progressive perspectives. And when it came down to the Q&A, sort of some of the questions from students, so one was like, okay, it's great, the university is committed to interdisciplinarity and we must do socially relevant research because we're decolonizing the university, but I'm in a department, and that department has a finite number of people, and those people have particular views of what is knowledge and what is not knowledge. So what do I do if I'm based in IR and I want to do this type of interdisciplinary study, and I'm told, one, that this is an IR, and two, that there's no one who can supervise that. And despite having this entire leadership structure of the university present, there were no answers to it, right? Because everyone can pay lip service to an idea. But when we get down to the practical steps of what does it actually mean for people going through the university and people meeting these stumbling blocks, there's no sort of structural institutional support to be able to answer that, right? So despite all the people who were there wasn't sort of any type of answer that could be given to these students' things. So my reservation, I suppose, about this idea is that, again, we're going to wax lyrical about coloniality at this abstract level. But when we get down to, and there was space, sort of in the title of the presentation, when we get down to the actual cases of coloniality that students and staff have to deal with, there's nothing to be said, right? So thank you, Paul, for doing that sort of conceptual work that I'm just going to abandon. And I also want to, so also thinking about the spaces and places that we think from, outside of, and coloniality, and come to colonize narratives of struggles that people were involved in without having any sort of idea of the sort of intellectual history of, coloniality and so forth. So there's actually two parts to what I wanted to share tonight. The one is sort of displacing the type of Latin American, whatever, Torres notion of coloniality because it aims at a particular point for a particular type of colonizing form. And then this is also about 100 years of university, not universities in general, but Wits University. So I also wanted to say specific things about this particular history and the type of traces and forms of coloniality that have existed here. so that I can also not do what I'm against in having this sort of abstract meta macro conversation without dealing with our actual university and its actual history and the ways in which it's currently and historically been complicit in forms of coloniality that still exist. So the first part is from the global south to Africa, the case for an epistemic decolonial turn towards the continent. And I start with two quotes. The first from Sentayu Alemu in The Meaning, Idea and History of the University and Higher Education in Africa, who says, there were famous ancient seats of higher learning in Africa before colonialism. It's not just a tag phrase, but it's something that we have to take seriously. The second is from Ngugi wa Thiong'o in Global Ethics, Theory and the Politics of Knowing, who says, and I quote, some presentations of theory have become like a gift, carefully wrapped in layers of beautifully colored paper that the recipient with great expectations spends hours opening only to find a nondescript item inside, and that's how I kind of feel about coloniality currently. So Latin American decolonial scholars such as Ramon Gross-Fugel, Nelson Maldonado Torres, and Walter Manolo have expounded on different elements of what they're calling a contemporary decolonial turn, marked by struggles against racism, imperialism, and apartheid. A term Sarah Chiwumbu argues has been present on the African continent for at least 5 decades through the work of people like Steve Biko, Ernest Césaire, Sheikh Anta Diop, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and others. Prior to the coup that brought Sankara to power, people like Joseph Kizubo had already begun working on a project for primary school curriculum that would, and I quote, reconcile traditional Sahelian ways of knowing with Western-style classroom-based pedagogy, end quote, in then Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso. In a recent, maybe not so recent anymore, article on the African University, Mamdani writes that in the 1960s at Makerere and Dar universities, the issues of deracialization of staff and curriculum content were already in contention, whereas issues of representation were dominant at Makerere. At the University of Dar, disbanding disciplinary nationalism was the priority of students and staff. Here, Mamdani uses disciplinary nationalism to describe what Lewis Gordon later calls disciplinary decadence. And so just to quote Gordon on that, this is the phenomenon of turning away from living thought which engages reality and recognizes its own limitations to a deontologized or absolute conception of disciplinary life. The discipline becomes, in solipsistic fashion, the world, and in that world, the main concern is the proper administering of its rules, regulations, or as Fanon argued, self-devouring methods. Becoming right is simply a method of applying as fetish the method correctly. Decay, although a natural process over the course of time for living things, takes a paradoxical quality in disciplinary formation. A discipline, for example, could be in decay through a failure to realize that decay is possible. Like empires, the presumption is that the discipline must outlive all, including its own purpose. So as long as the 1960s, the students at the University of Dar were demanding interdisciplinary scholarship to counter the growing irrelevance of higher education to the wider discussion of the country's social and political ills. What was clear then already was that the pedagogical structure of isolated disciplines was inefficient in dealing with East African politics. And so it was resolved that universities would undergo continuous curriculum review in order to maintain relevance. Which means half a century ago, the questions that now beguile South African universities had already emerged and been addressed in universities elsewhere on the continent. And I think this genealogy of epistemicide, told from a continental perspective, is crucial to understanding and responding to the current South African epistemic contestation because of shared histories of colonial oppression, but also shared intellectual histories of Black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, socialism, and more. It's also important to take note of the ways in which these challenges have been addressed in other universities on the continent, and the subsequent limitations and failures of instituted pedagogies and curricula on cognitive justice. This issue of the migration of cultural capital is no small matter in explaining the current desirability of decolonial scholarship from a global south rooted in a Latin American archive and not on the continent. So I think tracing, and I really like that framing as well, so traces of coloniality, beyond rhetoric, beyond these meta-narratives, etc. If we look at trace, the form of the trace, and I think tracing gestures towards spaces of intimacy, spaces of people's personal experiences, if we want to trace the breakages around the relationship between universities and their national governments and communities, it's also an interesting perspective on which to observe post-independence universities in Africa. For example, in Michael Kitinji's The State and the University Experience in East Africa, Colonial Foundations and the Post-Colonial Transformation in Kenya, he shows the multi-directional dynamism that links East African universities to colonial histories of British rule and post-colonial narratives of statehood, wherein both institutions are formed by and inform dominant policies and discourses. The Arusha Convention of 1981 placed regional cooperation and creative thinking in the transformation of higher education on the African agenda, intended to strengthen resonances across universities in the region through facilitating the movement of both lecturers and students. Now everyone wants to go to Oxford, Cambridge, NYU. We have this history. So although the usual issues that beguile the operationalization of agreed-on continental treaties remain, this establishment of the East African higher education area aimed at enhancing cross-border student mobility and harmonization of education systems on the continent, I think is an important development to think around. So I agree with both Ibrahim Mwanda and Fred Matianga, though, that the lack of vision by continental agents and the increasing investment and interest from external parties, we all know who fund our scholarships, through substantial funding from the private European sector, threatens the extent to which a new higher education landscape will be created. So this argument that public universities always serve the interests of the state or promote national culture has fascinating implications for South Africa, who in rhetoric is now under a democratic government that espouses principles of non-racialism and equality. Many have asked why the neoliberal agenda has overshadowed any commitment to substantive transformation of universities outside of representation, if such transformation can assist a national democratic project. So Lewis Gordon, following Sanon, suggests that the liberation of knowledge from its colonial history is difficult, as the very possibility of knowledge is now rooted in Western civilization. He says, and I quote, "If the epistemic conditions of social life were colonized, would not that infection reach also the grammatical level, the very grounds of knowledge?" So in the now seminal paper by Edward Blyden called The Aims and Methods of Liberal Education for Africans, he says, as president of the College of Liberia, that educating the African native is not purely, and I quote, for intellectual aims, but social purposes, for religious duty, for patriotic aims, for racial development, end quote. So the continued epistemic erasure of the native from institutions of learning has been perpetuated under both democratic and non-democratic national dispensations. So what to teach the native, curriculum transformation, decolonization, all these amazing things, cannot be simply to perpetuate systems of oppression such as colonialism, apartheid, and capitalism. To do this would be to mask the implications of integration of the native into these institutions in the democratic moment, right? So if structurally these institutions were founded on a logic that denies recognition of the genre of human that Black South Africans occupy, the question then becomes whether they have a place in the Black emancipatory project or they must be destroyed as a necessary step for forging a humanity denoted by whiteness. Now, if I have time, Lindy, I want to say some things about this. Can I? Can I?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll say some very quick things about this then. So I want to think a bit about the different moments that transformation at Wits have gone through. So Wits, as it's currently known, had its beginning in 1896 as the South African School of Mines and Technology. As one of the country's oldest tertiary institutions, Wits has had to navigate multiple political epochs, each with different social, economic, and political imperatives. Under the apartheid regime, Wits had the formal description of an open university. This means that it allowed admission of non-white students. Makubela and King note, however, that it nevertheless still, and I quote, reflected the range of racial attitudes within the South African society, end quote, which is important. Which is to say that members of its community included those with deeply held racist attitudes, as well as liberals who were slightly more open-minded. So the nature of its apartheid openness has allowed the institution to exist within this public imaginary as a liberal institution that was firm in its opposition towards apartheid and educated many liberation icons such as Nelson Mandela. But during the apartheid era, there were 4 universities described as open. These were UCT, University of Natal, Rhodes, and the University of Wits. In 1957, these universities released a statement titled The Open Universities in South Africa, wherein they affirmed their self-defined open status, as well as the principles of university autonomy and academic freedom. In particular, these universities were asserting the following 4 freedoms against the apartheid government attempt at forced segregation on campuses. First, who they may teach. Second, what may be taught. Third, how it shall be taught. And fourth, who may be admitted to study. And this is in their Open Universities in South Africa document. Thus, in this way, Wits attempted to position itself at the forefront of academic opposition to the apartheid state. But what exactly was the nature of this opposition? On close inspection, I would tentatively argue that Wits' opposition to apartheid was not premised on an ethical abhorrence of the dehumanization and degradation of Black South Africans, but rather on the idea of institutional academic freedom, which they still love, and autonomy being threatened. Southall and Cobbin point out that, and I quote, although the open universities may have committed themselves to liberal values, their liberalism was filtrated through structures which were racially based. Theirs, white academic and administrative staff, was a liberalism which was qualified by their socialization into and location in a situation of racial privilege. In short, theirs was a racial liberalism. For example, on the 28th of October 1987, the university held a General Assembly during which they reaffirmed their opposition to the state's interference with the institution's internal affairs. At this General Assembly, a plaque was unveiled on the Great Hall steps that captured the essence of the university's resistance, and it read as follows, and I'm going to read the whole thing, although it's quite long. The University of the Witwatersrand is dedicated to the acquisition, advancement, and imparting of knowledge through the pursuit of truth in free and open debate, in the undertaking of research, in scholarly discourse, and in balanced, dispassionate teaching. We reject any external interference designed to diminish our freedom to attain these ends. We recall our solemn protest against the intention of the government, financial sanctions, to force the university to become the agent of government policy in disciplining its members. We protest against the invasion of the legitimate authority of against proposed stifling of legitimate dissent, in the interest of all in this land, and in the knowledge of the justice to unremitting opposition to these intended of our autonomy. So like for me, what a peculiar statement, right, or not? Wits' primary grievance with the National Party's apartheid regime was that it encroached on the institution's autonomy and ethical laws which the government was attempting to promulgate through the controlled segregation of blacks, including in the sphere of education at all levels. There's no attempt to affirm the equality and humanity of Black South Africans, No mention at all of their right to education or their contribution to knowledge production. A hint, perhaps, of why in decades to come, the increased participation of Black people in the university is so marked with continuous protest actions and claims of deeply entrenched racism. As Bruce Murray so aptly notes, and I quote, "For critical observers, the formal protest Wits were never more than symbolic," right? So despite, or maybe I argue because of, the university's self-defined openness, Wits has been a site for much contestation and struggle between workers, academics, and staff since 1990 over the issues of the nature, content, and pace of transformation. As Makubele and King in their book called Apartheid No More, Case Studies of South African Universities in the Process of Transformation clearly show, an examination of Wits' institutional history suggests that its image of liberalness is at odds with its reality. Right? This is of course a position that still seems to be blind to the very violent and opaque consequences of liberalism itself for Black people and their emancipatory resistance projects. So in 2006, the Center for Higher Education commissioned a report on academic freedom that was completed by Christina Bentley, Adam Habib, good Lord, and Sean Morrow, entitled Academic Freedom, Institutional Autonomy, and the Corporatized University in Contemporary South Africa. In the report, the authors argued that indeed it is important for universities to expand their understandings of academic freedom to include a relevance to the social and political realities of that country. That said, however, as noted by Taylor and Taylor, the recommendations that emerged from that report, and I quote, relate to such matters as improved academic remuneration, entrepreneurial practice, and there's a way in which the word entrepreneur has entered like the academic space that is extremely worrisome, and income diversification, not the racialized structures of power and authority. So Professor Makgoba, whose removal from Wits by the Gang of Eight is a myth who anyone here should know about, or reality, writes on his reflections of becoming the VC of the newly merged University of Durban-Westville and the University of Natal into UKZN. And he says aspirations of social transformation and scholarship seem to be in conflict with each other. And I think this is an extremely important observation by Makgoba, that the narrative of transformation, read as the increased inclusion and promotion of Black academic, threatens scholarship insinuated as academic excellence and freedom. And this becomes one of the sort of most dominant arguments and potent weapons yielded by systemic racism within higher education institutions in their efforts to maintain the status quo, which we've noted before as being the hegemonic, prejudicial, and often mediocre dominance of white males in the academy. So I'm gonna stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Shibu. That has given us a lot to chew on. And I'm sure we all appreciate also that healthy dose of cynicism, which by this stage I think should be present in our ideas around coloniality, decolonization. So without restating what you said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow for one comment over there, and then I'm going to ask for a few questions. I'm going to try and bring in our participants in the sky, our YouTube live stream participants who perhaps have a couple of questions and comments. We can have a little break, refill our glasses, perhaps have another bite to eat, maybe discuss amongst ourselves for a few minutes some of the ideas that have come up. And I hope that you will all be staying for the last portion of this program, which will be about an hour of discussion between us. So, what did I say I was going to do? Comment. Okay. Thank you.
ke a leboga. Thank you for this occasion. I think last year when these celebrations were happening, I was one of those who was wondering when this kind of event will be put together. Now, my name is Rafaela. I work with the School of Arts. We are artists, reluctant academics, some of us. Ahmed stood up here, introduced himself as an academic. I know him as a stone thrower. Well, at least that's the first time I've met him, right? And this is context. I'm not just saying it. And Ahmed is very good at concocting guava juice as well. Now, what is guava juice? Now, this is history, right? And I'm taking this from a poem by Sandile Tikeli, Shake that guava juice, you know. So guava juice is a concoction that was made back in the day when we were young and mad and thought that, you know, decolonization. And it must be a violent project because we were very clear that colonization was violent, right? So we concocted this thing. So guava juice is a mixture of, you know, petrol and clay sand. You shake, and it explodes, right? So, so Ahmed, I don't want to say much, but this is not a biography. So we met at the time. So I'm saying this because I'm trying to provide hindsight as well, because we have a tendency of starting 7 years ago, and I know that it is one of the ways when we were students. We dealt with the security. Yeah, he knows. They couldn't bully us in the way that they are bullying the students today. We went to the gym. Yeah, we were prepared. No, because I'm saying this because I've seen how very recently the students were defeated. And they were defeated through violence. Because this is how you keep the colonial order. It's a violent process. And you keep it through violence. And we talk as if we are not at war sometimes. And it's important to recognize that this is war. Right? And war in many ways, I mean, I've spoken about physical violence. Right? We are in this building here. Right? This looks like decolonization. To me, it's consumption. Right? So, now, consumption in this way, in this building, I was in Taung 2 months ago to bury a friend of mine, and it's relevant what I'm saying, because in this building we have the Taung scar, right? It doesn't belong here. It belongs to the people of Taung. And those are some of the questions that I was confronted with when I was in Taung, right? Agere UNISA declared the place where the skull was found, you know, a heritage site. So it's also economy for those people, right? But we are incarcerating the skull, right? We don't want to return it because we think we can keep it better, right? Which in itself is an insult. That's why I'm talking about violence. I began with violence. This is psychological violence. So that is a very violent place in many ways. So let's not talk as if there's no violence. You know, and I've just demonstrated one idea of that. I mean, and if you think about even how, even we can talk about colonial scholarship quickly, right? Who's the guy who's supposed to have found the skull? Raymond Dart, right? What is this thing? It is, right? And I'm saying he's supposed to have discovered. Because when people discover things that they've never discovered, And this is the thing about scholarship, right? Where now, what I know from folk history, because we don't respect even history that we had our grandmothers, because you must quote somebody, I don't know. But you know, if you go to Tau, they mention the name of Remuto. Remuto was a bone collector. And he did not collect bones because he wanted to make soup. Then he collected ancient bones because he was conducting a serious study. And then comes a professor from somewhere. Oh, I see, you've got an interesting collection. Can I borrow that scar? So the rest is history. And this is scholarship, by the way. It's supposed to be scholarship. And people have built conversations that are supposed to mean that, you know, we must learn from white people. Learn what? Learn what? Because this is strange. Scholarship cannot be conducted if you are racist, because you're only selecting stuff that favors, you know, assumptions that proper coloniality. And we can go to the Gwembe Valley survey, that where they built, what do we call it? The Kariba Dam, scholars from France. Read, advised that that is the correct place to build the Kariba Dam, perhaps. But what were they destroying? You know, read about the Tongala priests, you know, and what the place meant for us who are into ritual. And the science that was supposed to be destroyed. And when I talk about science, you know, people think we are crazy, just, yeah, there's something about the drum, my sister, man. You said something about Sangoma. Nothing has disappeared. We have read them. So the answers are there. Go and ask your father, he said, yes, that knowledge will never disappear. It is there in our bodies. Right? I can say a lot, but I can see she's impatient. But you see, we don't travel with notes. These things are in our bodies.
Thank you for that really quite beautiful contribution to the discussion. So I did promise us a break, which is coming up now, and we will leave with a piece of music that Prishani has shared with us, all the way from South America. And I just want to read you a verse from this song that's in Spanish. It's called Somos Sur, which means we are South. So the lyrics are going to go something like this. You tell us we should sit down, but ideas can only rise us. Walk, march, don't surrender or retreat. See, learn like a sponge absorbs. No one is surplus, all fall short, all add up, all for us. We dream big that empire may fall. We shout out loud, there is no other remedy left. This is not utopia, this is a joyful dancing rebellion of those who are overrun. This dance is yours and mine. Let's rise to say enough is enough. Neither Africa nor Latin America are for auction. With mud, with a helmet, with a pencil, drum the fiasco to provoke a social earthquake in this puddle. So on that note, let's get a drink and reconvene in about 15 minutes. And let's chat amongst ourselves and come back with things to report back on. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for sticking around. I'm quite excited about this next part of the discussion. We'll start with a few comments that Prishani has said from Santiago, and then we'll take some questions and comments from you guys. And then I think what I'll say is, Paul and Shibu, if there's a question that you particularly feel like, yes, I want to respond to that, then you can respond to that, but also it's not necessarily a Q&A where you guys have the questions and the experts up here have the answers. If there's someone in the audience who feels like they want to respond to a question that came up across the room, then that is very much encouraged. So let's go over to Prishani, who's being represented by Tasneem there at the back.
Hi, apologies for my bad reading in advance. So Prishani says, thanks everyone for the contributions already made. Sorry for this long question and comment that I'm having to post in bits, but I'm itching to be there and be part of the conversation. So to Shibu, is the response you're suggesting to a theorization of the colonial experience on the Latin American continent by certain individuals in the global university? Does it not ignore the fact that there are different ways of relating to experiences in Latin America that do not emerge from the experts like Nelson and Minoru, but from those who lived and live the traces today, both within and outside the university? I agree with you at the level of your critique of people like them and how their positions have come to produce new relations of inequality at the level of knowledge. I think that Harry Garuba's argument for a contractional approach is more useful as it takes us beyond the ways in which traces are embedded in unilinear, homogenizing and place-fixed or fixed in place as geography approaches and the retraces. And I am using trace deliberately as it places time rather than geography at the center, for me anyway.
That's one for she. Okay, yeah, that's actually a good idea. Okay, thank you. We have a hand over here. Oh, do you mind? Is that okay?
Hello, my name is Yusukisi. I'm just trying to place the conversation also in practical terms for those of us that aren't from like the humanities side of knowledge. So some of us are in the economic and management sciences, and I'm just wondering, this concept of coloniality and decolonization and the infusion of indigenous ways of knowing, of what utility could that be for a guy or girl that specializes in corporate finance, who's going to walk into a world that is not decolonized, but with the local economy or the global economy, where you're talking about how to manage derivatives or even how to exploit them? How is this a conversation that we're limiting to the social sciences, or is it something that is, more pervasive in the totality of the creation and the dissemination of knowledge? And if the latter, I have a struggle in how, and to the lady in the interesting jersey, the different colors, so I don't know your name, to say, is there perhaps room to have a conversation along the lines of integration and transformation rather than just complete decolonization? The other thing I wanted to actually mention in the second question is, are we not perhaps and as I do mean this with respect, but are we not perhaps over-exceptionalizing the effect of colonialization in Africa and South America as if it has not happened anywhere else in the world, including what we now understand to be the Western world? They've been colonizing each other even in continental Europe. But I don't know that they're stuck in this sort of narrative of decolonizing education for purposes of some kind of intellectual advancement that immediately escapes me because I'm not in the humanities space.
Thank you. There was another
Yeah, can I
one.
quickly,
You can.
just tell the story quickly, and just to an umbrella leave after this. No, just, there's a paper by Zulu Matabo Zulu called drum telegraphy, right? What he explains there is how the drum works, yeah? And the combination of science and ritual. You conduct a ritual to incarnate the spirit of the tree into the spirit of the drum. You conduct a ritual to incarnate the spirit of the skin, whether it's the skin of the antelope, into that which will make the drum. You conduct a ritual to unite the two. Right. It all looks irrational to you. Right. It doesn't make sense. Because we are used to rationalistic ways of approaching phenomena. And that is a danger. So with this science of ritual, they also had mathematic considerations in what is the size of the drum. And they created a language which is unlike human language, but they could communicate things clearly using the drum. Then, and I'm talking about Africans here. And an example of that, the Motimele War of 1896. They ferry messages every day. Before this, what you have telephones, they could speak clearly with the drum to say this is exactly what is happening. To a point that white people thought we had telepathic powers, but it was the drum moving until some spy told them, no, these people are using this technology to speak. Technology, because you can say things precisely using the drum. And I'm not saying this for dramatic purposes. It is true. If you abandon rationalistic methods of thinking, because this is how we are trained in the West, that the only way to apprehend reality is if you think like white people. That, you see, in that, what I've told, because I grew up as Mohata. As Mohata, we know the names of the stars. Kamainaro, not Kamainasho. We calculate time. Before these guys knew about what was happening, we knew. Study German mythology, study Zulu mythology, study Bakata astronomy. Then you'll understand that we are not saying these things because there's no science. I'll stop there.
Sure, thank you. Does anybody else have a question or a comment or want to respond to that question?
Okay, quickly, as already said I'm not an academic. So I want to descend a little bit from the theoretical height and become more organic, become more practical. Maybe for noting, again, depending on which literature you look at and what text analysis you do. I recall the word white as referring to Caucasian people or the Europeans, so never existed up until the transatlantic slave trade. Again, I stand to be corrected. I just wanted to throw that in the mix. But I want to quickly go, like I say, I'm a pragmatist. I'm a practical person. So as we were listening to our colleague from Chile, I was in Chile in 2010. I actually watched the Bafana Wits Mexico match from Chile. South Africa was so beautiful. I watched the first country move from OR town to centenary. It was still really there. This country was beautiful from the other side of the world. But again, there were so many other parallels, such as the mining industry, which was the key sector in Chile and in South Africa. I was in Chile because I was in a campaign to ban cluster bombs, cluster munitions. Some of you know arms code and the rest of them that produce, highly sophisticated weapon system. Chile is an arms manufacturer as well. And in that front is where we're more or less parallel. The GDP per capita, the GDP overall, again, was more or less what we have here in South Africa. But again, as she's narrated, she spoke about 40-hour flight. I did more or less the same time, but I didn't go to Sao Paulo. I spent most of my time in Charles de Gaulle, that's in Paris. I spent about 8 hours there transit, and then link up to another 14 hours going down. Why I'm telling you this, because I think, again, France is a colonial power, and it still dominates most of, countries to this day. And, okay, maybe before the wine comes up, let me just stop here.
No, don't stop. Finish the talk.
You want me to finish up? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, so the point here is I'm the guy that connected dots. I didn't go to school, I dropped out here at Wits. I was here around 2000. I did short-term programs, etc. But I was also fortunate enough to run around in the corridors of the UN, specializing with what you call international disarmament, which is the field for those who went to school, international humanitarian law. Those who are lawyers probably know about the Geneva Convention and the rest of them. So I work on the Mine Ban Treaty, which is the treaty to ban landmines, anti-personal mines rather, to call them landmines because they were problematic in South Africa. But again, parallel to Chile, South Africa, because of the mines, they were quick, or it was easier to convert what you call dynamites, which is then going to crack the rocks and in the mines. And then in the wartime, which the war was pretty much against the liberation, I don't want to call them forces, but the liberation armies, MK, APLA, and the rest of them, or what they call the frontline state at the time, which was Mozambique, Angola, and the rest of them, if you recall those days. So during wartime, it was easier for South Africa just to convert the arms for military use, what they perceive. This is the old South Africa they perceive as. Chile could easily do that in the region as well. And then quickly, the last point being on the human mobility, which is still, again, at the time, South Africa seems to be the beacon of hope in the continent, in the region. Chile as well, more or less. You had most of the people in the region migrating to Chile to do work that, ordinary Chileans wouldn't really like to do, etc., which we still see here in South Africa. Maybe I should stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to Shibu and Paul and see if there are any threads that have come up that you'd like to pick up on. You can go first.
Maybe to Prishani's question and comment first. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, the people that I named, I think, don't dominate the Latin American archive around these things. I also had the privilege of going to Sao Paulo in 2016 and realizing how the people who've come to sort of like hegemonize the sort of decolonial scholarship in South Africa from Latin America, who are actually based in North America, are not the most prominent people there in Sao Paulo and amongst the people we were with, etc. So yeah, it's not a blanket critique of everything coming out of Latin America, but I think it's a particular type of decolonial intellectual tradition that I was trying to gesture towards, which I think actually has its prominence outside of Latin America, but also importantly in English. So there's definitely, I think, lots of forms or traces of resonances and solidarities and conversations that could be had outside of this sort of second colonizing archive that I was trying to speak about in that sense. So I definitely don't think we in any sort of disagreement there. The question about EMS, I'll try to say something too, but I think Paul probably would have more to say too, is that we're all humans and we all live under socio-political conditions. It doesn't matter if you do actuarial science or medicine or whatever it is, you know. And at the interface in which you engage with what for these purposes is called coloniality, no one cares that you're a doctor or an accountant or an anthropologist, you know. So I think it's important for you because it's important for the lives that we live in, the forms of power that we are exposed to and have to subject ourselves to, etc. But I also think there's something to be said about imagination. The types of world that we have a problem with now was not built on the social science or humanities foundation only. It's deeply medical, it's biomedical, it's economic, it's political, it's social, it's anthropological, etc. Right? Environmental, etc. So I think we all have that responsibility. And I also don't think you have to gesture towards why it's important. I think people who live in those positions across the university, outside of the university, feel it. I feel like you know why it's important even when you ask the question. Yes, because these sort of disciplinary boundaries are nonsensical when it comes to sort of our experiences of these things, you know. And there was a third question, or comment, or story, I can't remember. but yeah, I'll give it to Paul.
So I think for me it goes back to the question that I asked towards the end. How then do we center the colonial scholarship in ways that are cumulative and productive? Right? And if I have to speak about the boundaries that she referred to, how far are we actually vested in actually collapsing those boundaries? And if we do collapse those disciplinary boundaries, is it productive? Right? So it means again reimagining disciplines. Right? Because there's this thing that we speak about in education, where we speak about specialized knowledge and non-specialized knowledge, right? And most of the time what we refer to as non-specialized knowledge is knowledge of the marginalized, right? So how then do we bring it in a disciplinary space without necessarily doing away with the disciplinarity of the discipline itself? Because we need to actually engage in a disciplinary way, right? Hence I'm saying, if we speak about collapsing the boundaries, how far do we take it? And is that actually productive? So it goes back to my question. How then do we center the colonial scholarship in ways that are cumulative, meaningful, and productive? So I think that's where the debate should be. Because in my view, we know what the colonial experience has actually done and continues to do. And we know what decoloniality actually aspires to. So the question that we have to actually think about, deeply and theorize, is how then we position the decoloniality or the decolonial scholarship in cumulative and productive.
respond, okay, we have a couple of comments here, so let me just.
Thanks for the contributions. My name is Ulrike. I'd like to take up both of your comments, Shiva, your talk and your comments just now. It strikes me that while it's a very interesting exercise to look at the history of universities across the continent and in the global south in comparative perspectives over the last 50 to 100 years, I also think there's a good reason to look more closely at what happens locally between different universities. So I'm aware of the fact that a number of universities have celebrated their centenaries more or less the same time. University of Pretoria, Wits University, University of Cape Town, I think, UNISA, and for all of these occasions, there were these kind of public relations kind of exercises, coffee table books being printed, alumni being called in, and it would be quite interesting to do a comparison of what went into these coffee table books and what was highlighted and what was excised, exorcised. And that brings me to another idea, and I found it very interesting to go into the university archives and dig a little bit deeper, and that comes to the question of the disciplines, what happened in the disciplines, how knowledge formation and knowledge transmission worked in the various disciplines. I mean, there are students at the University of Pretoria who are going around, looking at departmental storerooms, filing cabinets, what they can find about the apartheid think tanks that academics used to be involved in. It's amazing what is unearthed in the process. Some of that finds its way into the university archives, but other stuff you find on flea markets, you find on, in really odd places, which also belongs to the history of universities, which is not written from, which cannot be written from a bird's eye view, but which is sort of, it gives you an idea of how certain patterns are hardwired into the institution and why transformation is coming up against such major obstacles. Because there are modes of transmission, of formation and transmission of knowledge that still continue. I mean, I can tell you lots of examples from my own experiences in some of the departments. I think there's a similar initiative going on at Free State University. I think somebody is writing the history of the philosophy department, for instance, at Free State University, coming up with previously unknown, and microstructural evidence, which should be very interesting to bring into the picture.
Thank you very much for such inspiring talks today. I'm just struggling a little bit, and I think I want to go with the gentleman here anyway. You're speaking about different spaces. And what you mentioned earlier about is, this discussion seems to be centralized around humanities. And the question I wanted, because I'm thinking about it, I'm like, in fact, us sitting here and talking about the concept of a university, isn't that the concept of, acquisition of knowledge in that space already a colonial concept? And how do you take that concept to try and decolonize it? Because, I mean, if you talk about colonization, we all have different experiences. Whether you are African, in fact South African, or whether you are German, in fact, or even, Indian. You all have different experiences. And as a result, you would have different concepts of what decolonization may mean to you. So as a result of that, how do you then start saying, okay, we want to decolonize without actually being specific to the specific needs of that community? Having said that, Once you then come to the situation like South Africa, or you decided now you want to dismantle Wits University, I'm thinking, to me, it's like when you bake a cake. You bake this cake, but it hasn't risen. But some people enjoy this cake, but you realize the cake has not risen, and you need a little bit more extra yeast in it. How do you put that yeast in that cake without actually throwing the cake away? If other people are enjoying it, the next time you bake the cake, do you need now to just throw all the eggs away? Or do you still use the eggs? You just add a little bit more yeast and make the cake rise. So I think it comes down to that, and I want to agree with you when it says, in decolonizing the universities, I think you have to keep what works, and you have to then integrate what indigenous aspects that you'll find that may be able to still be usable toward the development of and the process of development as a community, because you can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Okay, I'm gonna give it to Paul, and then maybe continue. Okay, cool. Thank you.
I think also one thing I need to add is around how we frame the indigenous side. In most of the conversation, we tend to frame the indigenous as this distant past that we can actually tap into, right? But I also think there's a danger in that how we frame the indigenous, we tend to actually go towards a space whereby we actually lock ourselves in the past, right? And that for me is dangerous, because what our ancestors actually produced then was determined by their context and conditions at the time, right? As a people, we have evolved over time. Yes, it's important to actually learn from the indigenous, but I think it's equally important not to lock ourselves in the past, because I think that for me is not productive at all.
Thanks, Paul.
So what I'm going to say is going to go into in a couple of different directions. The first one is about language. And, when these posters came out, they were really provocative within this space. And I expected them to do more within the politics of Wits. But what had happened, I think, between 2015, 2016 and the present is the ways in which this concept of coloniality, decoloniality, the critique of the university had shifted. If we look at the recent student protest, standing quite far away from Roads Must Fall, the character of some of the critique in relation to fees had remained. But the broader meta-narrative of coloniality, decoloniality, that seemed to kind of shift away from the student movement. And so I think we need to ask also about that. You know what I mean? What is it about this configuration at the present that has meant that, when we express the wrong, that we rise up and fight again, we don't use this term coloniality. And we also have to recognize that it also emerged in the student movement to name things that were otherwise named before. And so, in the moment of decoloniality, the critique of neoliberalism receded. To the extent that, perhaps, when we notice the term entrepreneurialism, and our managers were demanding that we entrepreneurialize our academic activity, a store of critique had been lost. And so I think it's important also that we recognize that, there are modes through which we feel certain forms of political wrong, but it's also questions of representation of how these are surfaced, how these become products or something that we struggle against. Now, this raises for me also a question about the ways in which the co-option of the decolonial movement and so on, so that, it's both my project and Habib's. It's both Shibu's project and the person who sent with the WhatsApp message on the group, if only. And I think one of the important things that emerged here, specifically in these debates, was the ways in which the question of the colonial relation was related to a mode of racial subjectification and subjugation and subjection. And I think why I'd like to hold on to that, and it comes back to, I think, where Shibu's last point, where her kind of, so there's a way in which, for Shibu's work, it's about how the native question, how did it get reinscribed in education? What is education for the native? You know what I mean? It still kind of comes to us, and now it's through modes of indigenizing knowledge. To sometimes very conservative ideas of what indigeneity is constituted by. So, I guess here, and this one comes back to this, is that if I'm following the current decolonial discourses, then there are multiple decolonial futures at present. And there's a political struggle over what decolonization we want. And I certainly, want to push Shibu's kind of comment on, the decolonization of finance, for instance. You know what I mean? Well, it's not simply, it's like, how have we tried to understand our form of relation in the world now and the form of world that we want to create? And maybe this is a kind of question that's more kind of posed by sociologists than it is by people who are basically preparing to go into the stock market. So at that level, I think that there is still a demand to clarify our constitutive project, but this becomes increasingly difficult. It's not so easy to say, hey, well, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater and so on, precisely because what is the criteria of evaluation? Do you say that this is a productive mode of critique? There has to be an imminent mode of critique that comes from a particular community that is also orientated towards some other vision of what the world ought to be or what the university ought to be. And that might be controversial or whatever the case might be. And so here, I don't call myself a deep colonial thinker. I don't call myself a decolonial thinker because my formation was in Marxism. And when I named it the wrong of the world, I named it in slightly other terms, even if others came and named it similar, later on. But I do think that what my work tries to move towards is decolonizing effects. That is, that I recognize that I'm constituted in this world in a particular way. And I'm constituted by forces that I don't always understand how they're constituting me. And through critique, you begin to understand that. But that also has to be linked to a particular political community that is also trying to reimagine some form of another way of being in the world. So that's for me, the project. But, look how few of us there are now, you know what I mean, for discussion of decolonization. So, yeah.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks also for bringing the protests and the strikes back into the conversation. And as we start to move towards rounding off, I'd perhaps like us to focus there and to think about this question of whether these concepts are I feel like this is quite corporate language, fit for purpose, whether they suit the struggles that are ongoing, and whether they're meaningful, or whether they can be made meaningful, whether they can be reinfused with meaning and with potency. So let's have a couple of comments at the back here.
Thank you so much. I mean, these were really beautiful presentations. And when I first saw this poster, for me, it brought back sort of memories of Business Fall, and particularly, this struggle for decolonizing the curriculum, right? Because, there were sort of fractures in the protests, or at least in the different, in the different sort of parties or different participants, right?
And as sort of the Black radical formation, we had the idea that, sort of like a Marxist language or Marxist rhetoric wasn't enough in terms of framing the struggle, of framing the antagonism, right? And we had to sort of like speak about curricula and speak about the ways in which we wanted to critique curricula and critique research production in the university. And decolonization was, I suppose at that time, decolonization sort of fit the kind of imaginary framework we had, right? Because there was a collusion in the Black radical formation, a collusion of obviously Afro-pessimism as an existential framework, but also Afro-pessimism as a critique of anti-Blackness in the university, and decolonization as a critique of, like, just, if I could say here, the ontic state of the university, so to speak, how the university exists and its history, the history of the university's existence, right? So for me, when I sort of like saw this poster, I was like, okay, this is quite interesting, because as Ahmed, says correctly, that, decolonization it was like our rendition of critique, our rendition of like big critique, meta critique of what the university is, where in the generation before that, which was, largely Marxian or neo-Marxian, so to speak, their critique was a neoliberal critique of the university. And I want to stress here that when we speak about, or when my generation of, of radicals speak about decolonization, of course there's the historical baggage. Well, it's not even baggage, but there's the epistemic historical baggage of anti-colonial struggles, anti-colonial epistemic struggles in the continent in Africa, and decolonial struggles in Latin America, right? And also, we need to also consider that these are still present and ongoing conversations and debates in the global South, right? People are really thinking about, and people have always been thinking about, the strength of colonialism, the sheer strength of colonialism, and how to sort of deconstruct or fight against colonialism. So I mean, I want us to think about also those sort of present global and ongoing debates. But yeah, my point here is that when we speak about decolonization, a part of our definition of thinking about the problem of coloniality and its antitheses, because that's what decolonization is supposed to mean, this antithesis of colonialism, what we, I think, as the larger radical formation in the academy would be stressing is the centrality of critique in how we produce knowledge and how we teach knowledge, right? So the problem with the university, and that's a problem that I think whether you're Marxian or whether you are like Afro-pessimist or whether you come from the Black consciousness stream, whatever phase of or whatever like dimension of radicalism that you come from, the problem we have is that our knowledge production is not critical enough and it's not creative enough, right? So this is why a radical scholar like myself or an emerging scholar is interested in indigeneity. When I study Credo Mutwa or when I study Mazizi Gunene, it's not this recuperation of a magical past, because that's not how they think about history. That's not how they think about philosophical concepts, and how, African thinkers think about that, how they rework philosophical concepts such as metaphysics or such as the history of ideas, right? Or such as time. How does time operate? What is the concept of space? What is the concept of reality? It's not like this sort of like, like magical recuperation of the past. It's about recreating ideas, right? And this is where I feel that people are not generous with how they read, quote unquote, indigenous knowledge systems, right? They're not generous in terms of really trying to understand what do these authors who wrote in the 20th century, by the way, or even if you look at the Bleek and Lloyd archive, right, which is not, it's not even 150 years old. But what is it that Thabo was trying to express when he spoke about, these sacred stories in Khoi and San, traditions? There's an imaginative and creative recuperation of what she was alluding to, because we're all struggling for this concept called the world, how to model the world, how to reinvent the world, and how to struggle for the world. So, I mean, I think that, you know, we mustn't be quick to, in our haste to be productive and in our haste to be, you know, cumulative or whatsoever, you know, or to produce certain effects or to have certain statistics at the end of the day. You know, we mustn't be quick to sort of have this sort of like overarching critique of decoloniality or indigenization or other sort of radical forms of critiquing this world, right? We need to really think about the tradition, and this is one thing that I think we need to, when we again look at these sort of like concepts and these trajectories, we really need to think about the history of that tradition. What is that history trying to do, and what kind of realities is it trying to confront, and what kind of reality is it trying to reconstruct, you know? And yeah, I mean, thank you both for your talks, but thank you especially Shibu, because I really appreciate, you know, your work on sort of tracing these sort of epistemic histories. It's not a problem, or even for, you know, well, it's not hegemony per se, but really struggling for the problem of knowledge production, what it is to produce knowledge, what kind of knowledge is produced, and what that the service of that knowledge. And it's not just a service for a service for problems to be solved now, but it's a service for, you know, problems that we are really struggling with, that reframe, or that sort of like that sort of like conduct, to use maybe Dumi's words here, to conduct our performance in the world. And that's how we need to look at these traditions. They are radical traditions, and radical traditions, you know, to reinvent, you know, certain prisms. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, I think it is time for us to round up, and a couple of things. I'd like to kind of return to the point of the limits of what the university can be, because it is something that I've thought as well. Like, maybe, you know, we do what we can in the university and accept that decolonization will never be a thing of the university. That we need new kinds of institutions, different institutions, where the decolonial thing for real can happen, and that the university will always be inherently antagonistic to it. So that's my curiosity about what you think about that. And then to return to the question that's been around about the protests now, and where this concept fits in with ongoing struggles and maybe future struggles. And then, of course, if there's anything that you want to pick up on that's come up, especially in the last contribution. Yeah, so I'm going to give these to the final words. Before I do that, I'm going to say if there's anyone that wants to make a very quick one. We have one more comment, and then we come in first to Paul and then to Shibu.
No problem. Yes, my name is Noah. I'm a first graduate in philosophy and politics. So I'm interviewing from a philosophical viewpoint. When you say decolonizing, you know, I see first it's not about decolonizing the space. It's mostly decolonizing the mind of the black intellectual. And when I say decolonizing the mind, it means allowing this mind to unlock its potential. We've got geniuses among us, but who are just strangled, you know, by the system agenda, for example, which doesn't allow novelty, inventions. So First about decolonizing that mind. And when you say the mind is free, the genius is free, is in the way that this genius may approach all the cultural heritage, not only African heritage. This mind has the ability to approach even medieval, European medieval heritage, for example. Modern European heritage, Indian heritage, Chinese heritage, provide that it has the ability to absorb all this heritage and to mold them into a new thing, a new invention. That's for me, that is decolonization. But now the question is it possible at Wits University? It's possible. It's possible if we can create spaces, not necessarily in our department, in our schools, but other autonomous spaces within the university where these genius can express themselves, and create such kind of platforms. But otherwise, if these platforms cannot be created because the ideology is too much entrenched into the university, interests are feel threatened, then, as you said, we should create new institutions. For example, what it's an autonomous institution. We can create more other autonomous institutions to allow these geniuses, to explode. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Noah. I'm going to have to Shimu.
Thanks, Lindy. I think three things, and it won't touch all the questions, but Prishani made a comment about Harry Garuba, and I'm a big fan, and I think Professor Garuba's work is extremely important, especially when we're thinking around translation, not in its literal sense, but how we translate ideas across space and place, etc. And then one of the important things that Professor Garuba offers us is this idea of local secrets of value, which is to say that there won't be the same level of legibility and value of particular ideas in the way they're narrated across space and place, and that's okay. And our job is not to translate that value for other spaces that don't see it, that don't comprehend it, that can't understand it. And I think that's extremely important, because the other thing I was thinking when I heard all the contributions that people offered was about this idea between legibility and power. So in the type of work that I do, and I trace the types of demands that have been made across time by students within the space that we call the university, they've been dominated by different types of meta-narratives in which they are understood. So I've been to many presentations in which I've spoken about the student movement, the types of demands that were made, the types of critiques that were made, and I won't say the word decolonization once. But every question that comes will be in the reference of, so if we're going to decolonize, and I used to be confused to say, okay, so, and I had to get to a point to say, okay, well, must I think about this strategically and tactically? That if this is the way in which it translates in this moment, that people hear these demands and people hear this critique as subsumed under decolonization, what can we do with it? But the reality is that this level of demand has existed long before this trending notion of decolonization, long before even transformation, right? So I think we have people like the word crisis these days. Crisis of capital, we have crisis of funding. We really do have a crisis of imagination. And we also have a crisis of power, because people have understood tactfully, strategically, that if I don't speak within a language of legibility, my demands, my activism, my everything disappears, right? And you also become positioned in a way, so I can say, I didn't say this I didn't say decolonization. But that also positions you in a way that disadvantages you, because the dominant perspective is that this is the progressive, this is the radical, this is, you know what I mean, this is whatever that is. So I think legibility and creativity have an extremely tenuous relationship, because the forms of creativity that I want to invest in, the forms of creativity that have the potential to birth the type of world I want to both live in and see, are not legible intentionally. So what does that mean? Do I continue to speak within intelligibility, or do I take up what people say is a strategic, tactful form of activism in which you interpolate your struggles within the dominant legibility of the time, whether it's anti-neoliberalism, anti-racism, or now decolonization, etc. But I think we also have a long enough trajectory of studying struggles, of studying social movements, of studying etc. to say, if you fall for that trap of legibility, what's most likely going to happen is a reproduction of the very things you are struggling against to begin with. So I have less qualms now in my old age of being intelligible, of being misunderstood, of being misrepresented, because there's something about, and we say it as metaphor, the explosion of the world that we live in, the recognition of different types of worlds that insists on us being unrecognizable in the dominant formation of the world that exists right now. And I think a lot of times people aren't willing to accept that, people aren't willing to risk that. I mean, if we think about the student movement, which you've tried to push us to speak about, even though we haven't, one of the, just to give a quick example, is that one of the people was saying, oh, free education, okay, but who's going to pay for it because it must be paid for? It's like a sort of dominant thing that goes through popular media, within academic circles, among intellectuals, without seeing the ways in which that is a particular type of colonization of how you understand what education is, how it is transmitted, or like who will pay is offered as this commonsensical question that any sort of normal person should answer and understand as reasonable, as if payment is like a natural thing, right? So I think a lot of the times that I don't care for the people on the oppressive side of it, but I try to think, a lot of my work around curriculum tries to think about the ways in which those of us who struggle against these things, our consciousness, our arsenal of concepts and language and comprehension is equally predetermined by the things we're struggling against. So that even at our most creative, even at our most radical, we fall into these pitfalls of reproducing neoliberal, capitalist, etc. logics, right? Which is very easy to see across the ways in which we represent our struggles, beyond just the sort of gendered and etc. Right? So I think the last thing I'll say is that if we are going to be creative, intentionally creative, we have to acknowledge that that's going to come with a great deal of unlearning, a great deal of discomfort, a great deal of accepting our own inadequacies of preparation for the very thing that we want to do, right? And I think a lot of times that sort of reflection is shied away against. We want the same type of activism that gives answers, that is confident, that is, and that's not creative, and that's not what we need.
Okay. So mine is very short, is to actually clarify around what I meant about the dangers of looking ourselves in the past. So certainly we can learn from the past, right? There's no question about that. So the point I was trying to make is that in as much as we can learn from the past, we also have to imagine the indigenous in the modern world or the postmodern world. So what does it mean? Because
in this discussion, and thank you to everybody who came through and stuck around and made these really thought-provoking contributions, and of course many threads came up, and hopefully some of them will just stay with us as individuals. Maybe others of them can be picked up in future discussions that we have, which we hope that you will join us for as well. And I think the only thing left for me to say is some thank yous. So to the Argent Center crew, there isn't actually anyone here, but thanks to the Argent Center for having us. And thanks to all my colleagues at SWOP for really doing the most to bring this all together. And thank you to Mantis and her team from Wits Catering who brought us this beautiful food. And yes. And yes, once again to everybody who's here, thank you. Obviously, you make the party. So get home safely and see you again in the future. And thank you, and let's have a round of applause. Oh, and to Prishani and everyone who joined us online, thank you very much. Okay, claps now.